When I first started to consider Zappa's approach to composition, I had the erroneous idea that all composers who wrote classical music could hear everything in their head and commit it all straight to manuscript paper without the use of an instrument. This was a kind of a romantic idea, I suppose, that had filtered into my subconscious, I guess, from reading about Mozart and his perfect pitch and how he could hear symphonies in his head and just commit them straight to manuscript paper. This was further compounded by some texts I read in the Real Frank Zappa book, where he's talking about composition and how he used to love drawing dots and beams on paper and how wonderful it was that he could hear everything in his head. I also read an interview with Kent Nagano, who was talking about the London Symphony Orchestra sessions and how he really liked working with a composer who could tell the difference between a B natural and a B flat. Now, at the time, I wanted to be a composer, and so I was interested in how Zappa went about composing because I was just fascinated by his music. So I thought, well, that's what I have to do. I have to practice, I have to study, so that I can hear it all in my head and just write it out to manuscript. So I spent a few years doing this. I bought scores and would follow them diligently, meticulously, trying to memorize sections and visualize them in my head and try and hear the notes, try and hear all the textures and the layers. And after about 2 years, I did start to hear things. I could hear string sections, brass and woodwind combinations, flurries of notes and chords. But I had no idea how to write it straight to paper because I didn't know what pitches I was hearing. Now, I have relative pitch, which is common amongst musicians and composers, but I do not have absolute pitch. So you get this kind of sound with the G flat, and I'll play the G flat one there. Although I was hearing things in my head and they're very vivid, I had to use an instrument to write them out. You need a medium between the head and the paper, and that can be a guitar, it can be a piano, it can be anything. And then one day I found this interview with Frank Zappa from about 1975. I was quite surprised after reading it. If I can quote it to you, he said, "I don't think of notes when I'm playing at all. I'm absolutely tone deaf. If George Duke starts playing in some key, I can't tell what key he's in. And the only way I can find out what key he's in when he's improvising is by sneaking around on the guitar and hitting a couple of notes to find out what he's doing. Other people in the band have perfect pitch and they just hear it right away and say that's an A and just start playing, but I can't do that." So that was very confusing because in the Real Frank Zappa book, he explains his compositional process as if he's just hearing it in his head and writing it straight to manuscript. And here, by his own admission, is saying he's tone deaf. In a way, I felt a bit relieved, I suppose. You didn't have to have perfect pitch in order to write the music that you wanted to hear. Another quotation that I found quite interesting was from Stravinsky. Again, if I can quote to you, he says, "Fingers are not to be despised. They are great inspirers, and in contact with a musical instrument often give birth to subconscious ideas which might otherwise never come to life." Now, Stravinsky didn't have perfect pitch either.
The piano is, as you can hear, both dampened and quite out of tune. While visiting composers and musicians would like to try his piano, and they all were quite appalled to find it was out of tune. Didn't bother Stravinsky in the slightest.
Now, just because you don't have perfect pitch, it doesn't mean that you can't write straight to manuscript. In the case of Zappa, he had been composing for many years. I guess this was the importance of recording all his orchestral performances so that he could discard things that didn't work and further refine and develop things that did. After a while, you know that certain combinations, certain chords, certain melodies are going to work, and you can just write them out without the instrument. And then there's the speculative approach, where you're trying to devise some new theory. In fact, some of the compositions that were prepared for the London Symphony Orchestra were written speculatively.
Don't get ahead. And
I was interested in this approach, and I corresponded with Ed Mann a few years ago, and he got back to me, and if I could just quote what he said about this speculative approach. He said, certain pieces such as the mainstays we all know well were voiced out on the piano first, and Zappa knew exactly what they sounded like before bringing them to the band or ensemble. He would spend hours at the piano and guitar experimenting with voicings. At other times, for example, much of the LSO recordings 1983, I am certain that he relied only on theory and a speculative experimentation without hearing the results first. Now, there are some compositions that sound like they were composed this way. One that comes to mind is Bobbin de Kroon. It seems quite funny when I think back about my first impression, or my naivety, if you like, this sort of erroneous idea that, you know, it's all in the head and straight to paper. I can't say I wasn't slightly disappointed when I found out that wasn't the case. Not disappointed in Zappa, but disappointed in the fact that I had really believed this and found out, you know, that it wasn't true. But as I said, it kept me in good stead because it forced me to practice really hard, even though I didn't achieve what I set out to achieve in this context. I saw this documentary recently called Tim's Vermeer, and it's about Tim Jennison, who's like this entrepreneur, video engineer, who decides that he's going to recreate Johannes Vermeer's The Music Room. It's a beautiful painting. He was inspired by a book written by Philip Stedman, who questioned whether Vermeer had painted this without any technology, without any appliances. And it turns out that he used the camera obscura, which is a device, a piece of technology that reflects light. However, art historians were up in arms because it had taken away the romantic idea that Vermeer painted with a naked eye and didn't use any devices whatsoever. So Penn Jillette, who's a friend of Jennison, is in this documentary, and he makes this really profound comment that about the whole process, and that Vermeer has gone from being an unfathomable genius to a fathomable genius. I just thought that was great. And in some ways, the same thing, in a very small way, happened for me with Zappa's compositional process. And the fact that he didn't have perfect pitch made absolutely no difference to his creative imagination and the amazing music that he created.